Hello followers of Neuro Takeaway, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to show you some interesting data from the last edition of the Actives Forum that took place virtual. Thanks again to the pharmaceutical company Symptom Bago for the support for attending this meeting. And let's go to the data. Well, I would like to show you this controversy about a relatively new concept, which is PIRA. PIRA stands for Progression Independent from Release Activity. It was discussed in the context of the Charcot Symposium. And this meeting was in charge of Professor Giancarlo Comi. Giancarlo Comi is an expert in the field. He works at the University of San Rafael in Italy. And he showed this very well-known picture of the different curves of this disease. You can see here the evolution of the clinical disability, the MRI activity, brain volume loss, the activity of the relapses of this disease. And as you know, this process is characterized by a very interesting evolution. At the beginning of the disease, there are a lot of relapses, most of them with remission, complete or partial. And then it is followed by the phase of progression, at the beginning with some relapses and then just progression. But if you follow this curve proximally all the way to the beginning of the disease, you can see on green a very steady line, which is the silent progression. And as we said, this progression involves two concepts. One is the PIRA, and the other is PIRMA, which is more challenging and stands for Progression Independent of Relapses and MRI Activity. He also stressed the importance of this discussion. This is not just a theoretical issue, it has a lot of practical implications, especially on the definition of clinical trials about treatments, and moreover, it has implications for the authorities, the health insurers, the payers, for the approval of different treatments. The first conference was given by Professor Tanja Kuhlmann, who is a neuropathologist at the University of Münster in Germany. She had the responsibility to speak in favor of the concept of PIRA, and she made a case by showing several facts. The first one was the presence of these focal lesions that she called the active-inactive lesions. Well, you can see at the bottom on the left side the presence of an active lesion, which does not stain neither for MVP nor for other myelin staining, but there is a diffuse infiltration in these lesions by microglia and macrophages, which stand for CD68. These lesions have two possible fates. One is to go to an inactive phase in which there is no staining for MVP, and there is no staining for microglia, there is no inflammation. But the other interesting fate is to go to this active-inactive phase, in which there is no staining for MVP, but there are a lot of microglia cells and macrophages at the periphery of these lesions. These cells have a pro-inflammatory activity. They stain, as we said, for CD68. And the characteristic of these lesions is that they have the tendency to expand over time. At the bottom on the right side, you can see two papers, one by the group of Daniel Reich from the NIH. In this case, Dr. Absinta showed the possibility to detect these lesions on MRI. This is a paper that had a pathological correlation with MRI, and you can see that these lesions tend to expand over time. And on the right side, there is a paper from Elliot. Dr. Elliot showed here an important concept that these lesions correlate very well, including better than brain volume, with the clinical disability of the patients. So at the top, there is a graph, a cartoon, showing the different flavors of MS lesions. She showed two very interesting papers. On the right, you have a paper by Lucchetti, where there is a correlation between the relative percentage of different kind of lesions. The green ones are those active, inactive, with the evolution of the disability, and it's very clear that these lesions are related with more progression of this and more rapid progression of this disability. And on the right, you have, on the left, sorry, you have the paper by Fisher, and here there is a correlation between these different kind of lesions and the evolution in time of the process of the disease, and it's quite evident that there are more lesions in the later stages of the disease, but you can find some of them at the very beginning. Changing gears, she showed another fact that stands for the presence of this PIRA concept. So she showed here two papers, one on the left by the group of Lassman, in which there is a comparison of different pathological characteristics and features related to the relapsing remitting form and the secondary progressive form of MS, and they show that there is diffuse inflammation of the white matter in the secondary progressive form. This is revealed by the presence of diffuse infiltration with microglia and the presence of perivascular inflammation that significantly is more prevalent in this form, in these progressive forms of the disease. On the right, you see another fact, the presence of leptomeningeal inflammation. This was proved by several authors. Here you have a paper by Magliozzi, where you can see these lymphocyte follicles at the leptomeningeal level, which are more prevalent in the faster forms of the disease. And this is another proof of like a silent process of inflammation in MS. Another paper from the group of Magliozzi, in which there is a very interesting relationship between the presence of this leptomeningeal inflammation with the presence of cortical lesions, demyelinating lesions, especially at the level of the subpial layer. And she also stressed that this neuronal loss is not a focal process at the level of the inflammatory aggregates of the leptomeningeal spaces, but it's a diffuse process. And one of the explanations of these diffuse neuronal loss is the failure of a compensatory mechanism that neurons have through mitochondria. When in this graph, in this cartoon, you can see that when there is an inflammation and demyelination at the level of an axon, the soma tends to send more mitochondria in order to increase the remyelination. But these mitochondria in an inflammatory milia tend to have more mutations and may degenerate. And when they come back to the soma, they provoke the death of the neuron. So this is one of the explanations, at least to this diffuse and subtle but significant neuronal loss. And she also showed another mechanism of compensation, as is the neuronal plasticity. Here you can see a paper from the group of Fleischer that was published last year, in which they showed a clear relation with the recruitment of more and more areas for performing a certain task with time in stable patients with MS. And they also showed the presence of an increase in brain connectivity of these patients. It showed an interesting combination of facts. You can see here that the presence of remyelination is very active in inactive lesions and in inactive lesions, but not in the smoldering or active inactive ones. So this again stresses the importance of these kind of processes that are related with harmful. She showed another very interesting point, as is the combination of facts. You can see here the relationship between the different types of lesions in MS patients and the capacity of remyelination. Here it's evident that this capacity is high in the active lesions and is also present in the inactive ones, but there is no capacity or very poor capacity of remyelination in the active inactive lesions, again stressing the importance of these type of plaques for the disability of our patients. She stressed that this disease is not a dichotomy between relapses and progression, but it's like a continuum of processes that take place in the brain, and you see that these processes are more prevalent at the advanced stages of the disease, but they are also present at the very beginning in a silent way. Another speaker that had the responsibility to speak in favor of the concept of PIRA was Professor Ludwig Capos, who works at the University of Basel. He's a giant in the field, and he showed some other evidence. For example, this paper from the Magnim's group, in which you can see that the brain volume loss is present at the early stages of the disease, including at the level of the clinically isolated syndrome. He showed more evidence of this presence of neurodegeneration at the early stages of the disease. You know that now we can measure in serum the presence of neurofilament light chain, and this is associated with neuronal damage. So in this paper, they show that this increase of neurofilaments is associated with advanced stages, with relapses, but they are also may be present at the beginning of the disease. Finally, Professor Ludwig presented the experience from clinical trials and observational studies about certain different very good drugs against MS, for example, natalizumab, ocrelizumab, or ofatumumab. As you can see in these graphs, they do very well on the relapsing rate, and they decrease the MRI activity, but they are not so good at diminishing the progression of disability, indicating that there are another mechanism that go well beyond the inflammatory activity from the very beginning of the process. And with this, I would like to thank you for watching, and I remind you that next week we will have the other stance against this PIRA concept that will be given by Professor Fred Lublin. So see you next week. Bye-bye.